Hello.
Hello there.
Hello.
How are y'all doing today? It is Sunday on a kind of cloudy, dreary day out
Dreary
there,
day.
but that means it is time for the
Yes.
evening counting of the Omer, 6 o'clock.
There you go.
Glad that y'all are here. And it is going into day 16
Day 16.
of the counting of the Omer, day 16 of 50 total.
That's right.
Of all the days. That's what the scripture talks about, and the counting between the first fruits and what we call Pentecost is really, in Hebrew, it's the Shavuot, or the Feast of Weeks. So we are at a special time for all of that. So let's start off with the blessing for the counting of the Omer.
Mm-hmm.
And did I say it last night, or did
I don't
you?
remember.
I don't. I'll say it tonight.
Okay.
It says, Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu al seferat ha'omer. Blessed are you, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who has sanctified us by his commandments and commanded us about the counting of the Omer.
Amen.
So that's where we're at.
That's where we're at.
And we have been in the book of Galatians.
Galatians, y'all.
And
This is a big one.
there is a whole lot in here. And of course, as we've talked about before, when people are critical of the messianic perspective,
Mm-hmm.
and our relationship to Torah and such as that, Galatians is like everybody's trump card. Everybody wants
That's where they
to.
all go.
Oh well, if you believe in the Torah and if you have this
Sometimes
messianic
Romans.
perspective, then you must hate the book of Galatians.
We like the book
And
of
actually,
Galatians.
no, we like it a lot. It has a lot of things to say about these very issues.
Yes,
So,
it does.
how would you sum up, what we've been saying so far on the previous night?
Well, again, Galatians is entirely about justification, how one comes to salvation, how one is initially saved. And the Torah does not do that, cannot do that. To put it in that position is to put it out of order.
Mm-hmm.
In order for someone to be saved, justified, set right with God, they have to go back to the Abrahamic covenant and come in by faith
And by promise.
and by the promise.
Yeah. So the promise made to Abraham is included the Gentiles all along.
Yes.
And some of these that were what are typically known as the Judaizers, or the ones that were coming in and trying to say, no, you're accepting Messiah as Gentiles is not good enough. You have to start over with coming to Moses and keeping the Torah, converting in a legal sense, by going through the process of conversion, which was known in the general category as circumcision. Unless you start with that, then your coming to Messiah doesn't count.
Right, because before Messiah came, in order for someone to come into the family of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they literally had to convert.
Mm-hmm.
That was the way to come into the family. But now that Messiah has come, is that still the way people come into the family?
And that is the question that he's dealing with, because the Jews, they were understood themselves as being, we are the sons of God.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a category, a status, a legal understanding. And if you didn't convert before Messiah came, if you didn't convert, then you were not considered a son of God. But once you did, then that category, or that status of you are now a son of God, you are son of Abraham, a descendant of Abraham, was yours. But Paul all along has been arguing that no, you've received the Spirit, you've seen the miracles,
Yes.
you received both of those by faith in Messiah, Yeshua. And so that proves that you are sons of God. That proves that you are descendants of Abraham. And he said that in chapter 3, as we talked about last night. But now, and this is verse 25, he says, but now that faith has come, we are no longer under this guardian, preparing for the coming of Messiah. For you are all sons of God through faith in Messiah Yeshua, through trusting in Messiah Yeshua. So they've already attained this salvation category of being a child of Abraham.
Yes.
The Gentiles have already received that. And chapter 3 ended, with them talking about there is neither Jew nor Greek, there's neither slave nor free, male nor female, for you are all one in Messiah. You are all together in Messiah, regardless of what you started with, by faith and trust in Messiah alone. You are a child of Abraham. You are part of the family. And then he says in verse 29, and if you belong to Messiah, then you are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. So that's the what he starts with. That's where he's been building. Remember, Paul is a legal scholar.
Yes.
And he is building an argument over and over again. These were the criticisms that the Judaizers were coming in and trying to convince them that no, your belief in Messiah doesn't count. You have to start over.
Yeah. And again, to also a little bit of a review, Paul hits this in Galatians chapter 2, but the Jerusalem Council of Acts 15 had already taken place, which meant that decision had already been made. Remember, Yeshua said, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will be loose in heaven, which meant they had the authority to make decisions for the believing community. And they had made that decision. And these people coming in and trying to confuse the Galatians were going purposely against that decision. And Paul is calling them on it.
Just like he called Peter back
they are
in chapter
out of
2.
order.
So he's correcting them on these things. So they are the Gentiles. He's already established are heirs, are Abraham's seed, are sons of God. And so he opens up verse in chapter 4, giving more evidence and more convincing proofs of all of this.
And this is some good stuff.
And this is. So verse 1 says, now I am saying, so long as the heir is under age, he is no different from a slave, and even though he is the owner of everything. Instead, he is under guardians and managers until the date set by the Father. So this is backing up a little bit. Remember, there were no chapters and verses when he wrote this.
Right.
So he is continuing this discussion about, having the manager, having the guardian, and the Torah was that. The Torah was that for the Jewish people. This is what gave them their identity. This is what held them together, gave them a sense of community, gave them a sense of fellowship. It was the Torah that held and defined everything for them leading up to the coming of Messiah.
It kept them safe together until they were, as the illustration says, old enough for their inheritance.
Yes. And so safe from what, by the way?
Safe from the pagan world and the deceptions of idolatry.
Absolutely.
Right.
So what we have to understand in verse 1, and this is what sets up the rest of chapter 4, the heir in this passage are the Jewish people. They are the ones who have received everything. Theirs is the promise. Theirs is the Torah. Theirs is the temple service. All those things that Paul says, the covenants. All of those things that Paul says was their benefit, and the good things that God had given them. That's the kind of things. This is what they are the heir of. So if the Jewish people are the heir, then who are the slaves?
Who are the slaves? That would have been us.
That would have been the Gentiles are the slaves in this situation. But notice what he says right off the bat in verse 1. Now I am saying, so long as the heir is under age, he is no different from the slave. In other words, before Messiah comes, the heir is no different than the slave as far as what their salvation status is about.
Yes, he's the firstborn son. Yes, he is the heir. Yes, he is the one that God is pouring everything into. But he doesn't yet have the authority of a son in a legal status.
Yeah. Salvation is not by those things. Salvation is still by faith in what's coming.
Yes.
And so even though he is the owner of everything, instead, he is under guardians and managers until the date set by his Father, or set by the Father. again, those owners, the guardians and managers, that's the Torah. That's those things that he'd said back in chapter 3 are there to keep and hold them together.
Yes.
And so also, when we were underage, and notice he's using the term we, so he's including himself. When we were underage, when we were not ready to, when it was not the time to take that step and responsibility and salvation. So we were underage, and this has images for the Jewish people, and all about the bar mitzvah ceremonies and such as that, when a boy is brought to a position of adulthood. So also, when we were underage, we were subservient to the basic principles of the world. We were operating in this system, in this world. The Torah is what's holding us together. And then verse 4 says, but when the fullness of time came, and that's a reference back to the verse 2, until the date set by the Father.
Right.
When the fullness of time came, God sent out his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, born under the Torah. And he's doing what? What is he doing? He is freeing those under the Torah so we might receive adoptions as sons. So even the Jewish people who were waiting for that adoption, waiting for that elevation of status from being underage to being mature or being an adult with rights, with responsibilities, and all those things. So they were being taught, they were being trained, they were being held together by the Torah and the Word of God until this time when Messiah comes. And when Messiah comes, they should be ready to recognize him, ready to receive him, and then really fully take off as members of the community of faith.
Yeah. They're ready for their bar mitzvah. They should be ready to just soar. Yeah. Good stuff.
So Yeshua came at that point to free those under the law, to set them free, to fulfill their goal and their purpose, which was to be what? What was their goal and purpose as the firstborn of God? To be the
light to the Gentiles.
The light to the Gentiles. To be the ones that drew them in and brought them to faith in God themselves. To free those under the law so we might receive adoptions as sons. Now, verse 6, because you are sons, and so he's switching from we to you. So he'd been talking to or about the Jews. Now he's talking about the Gentiles. Now you, because you are sons.
Because they've been included through the Abrahamic covenant.
Because they've been brought in by faith. Because this day appointed by the Father has come. Messiah has come, and you have been included and brought in.
Through the Abrahamic covenant.
Because you are sons, and he's saying that as a statement of fact, not to be disputed.
Correct.
God sent the Spirit, the Ruach of his Son, into our hearts. Both Jew and Gentile. Remember, he was talking about the Spirit. You received the Spirit not by keeping the Torah, but by faith. That was the beginning of chapter 3. So, God sent the Ruach of his Son into our hearts, who cries out, Abba, Father. And so, you, Gentiles, are no longer a slave. Remember, that's the identity that came out back in verse 1. There was the heirs, who were the Jewish people. There were the slaves, who were the Gentiles. So he says, you are no longer a slave, but now you are a son. Just as
also an heir.
Also a son, and if a son, also an heir.
And remember, he puts it in Ephesians in terms of you are no longer foreigners and strangers to the covenants.
But fellow citizens.
But fellow citizens of God's household.
So all of this is building the point that through Messiah, the Gentiles have been brought in to the family.
Yes.
And he is making the point that you don't have to start over. This is not a disputable matter. This is settled because of what was the promise that came through Abraham. You have been brought into the family. You are not an outcast. You're not a lesser than. You're not any of those things. You are brought in, and you are brought in as a son. You are an heir through God, or heir of God through Messiah, is how some of the translations will say. But then he backs up a little bit for them in verse 8.
He reminds them what they were.
Yeah. And we need those reminders of what we were and what we've been brought into.
Yes.
So verse 8 of chapter 4 of Galatians says, "But at that time, previously, when you did not know God."
So he's using the pronoun you again.
He's using the you again to talk about the Gentiles.
Yes.
"But at that time, when you did not know God," before you came to faith in Messiah, in other words, "you served those who by nature are not gods at all." So he's referring back to their life and their experience as pagans. But now you have come to know God through who? Through who?
Through Yeshua.
Through Yeshua, through the Messiah.
Through Jesus, right? Through Yeshua. Amen.
Or rather, you have come to be known by God.
Yes.
In other words, that you have been essentially, we think back to that picture of what was the movie, Ben-Hur?
Yes.
How you had a Jewish man who was on a Roman galley as an oarsman and such like that. He ends up saving this important Roman general, and they have this moment where he is officially adopted into this Gentile family. If y'all remember that, or maybe you haven't seen that movie, you should, because it's really pretty good.
The older version.
The older
is
version,
better.
yeah, the older version is much better.
Charleston Heston did a great job on that one.
So he is adopted, and it's almost like there's a ceremony, there's this announcement of his name and his new family and all of these other types of things. So that's a picture of what the ancient world viewed and how it viewed adoption. So you have come to know God, or rather, you have come to be known by God. In other words, he has spoken your name and invited you into the family. So how... Now that your identity has changed, how can you turn back again to those weak and worthless principles? Do you want to be enslaved to them all over again? In other words,
they were never enslaved to the Torah before they came to God.
They weren't enslaved to the Torah.
So that's not what they're going back to.
Mm-mm. And Paul would never call the Torah and those things weak and worthless principles.
No.
That's not the Jewish view of the Torah. That's not what the view of the New Testament is regarding the Torah.
You don't say that of the Word of God. That is the Word of God.
Mm-hmm. So basically, if the Judaizers were correct and they had to stop and back up and start over, they were basically arguing, no, you have to go back to your identity as a pagan and then start the conversion process to Judaism before you can then come to Messiah after you get all that stuff done.
Right.
So how can you turn back again to that old life, to those weak and worthless principles of your paganism and your idolatry?
And remember, they were also getting pressure from their Gentile family and friends.
They very much so
to come back into that life as well.
Mm-hmm.
Because again, they were seen in the Roman world, they were seen as traitors. They were seen as people who had left the safety of the gods for this one God, this Jewish God, and they no longer went to the temple of Caesar to sacrifice to Caesar. They were seen as traitors. And so there was pressure from that end as well.
Both sides were wanting them to get back into it. And that's really ultimately the tactic of the enemy anyway.
Yes.
To get you tied up, whether it's from a religious side or from a family side or whatever it is. He wants you to go back to what you were before you knew Christ, before you knew Messiah. So he's saying, now that you have come to know God, or rather you've come to be known by God, now that you've been brought into the family by faith, how can you turn back to those weak and worthless principles of your paganism? Do you want to be enslaved by them all over again? And he says, verse 10, you observe days and months and seasons and years. I fear for you that perhaps I've labored over you in vain.
So they were kind of going back a little bit. They were going back home and having festivals, pagan festivals with their family.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Well, my mom wants me to come home for such and such festival. What am I going to do? They'd go home and they'd celebrate this festival with their parents.
Like they always had.
But notice what he says. Do you want to be enslaved all over again? Remember, their identity before at the beginning of chapter 4 was that of the slave.
Mm-hmm. They were the slave as the Gentile.
And now they've become sons,
Mm-hmm.
set free and become sons. And he's saying, you're going back and you're enslaving yourself all over again. Mm-hmm. Kind of like the children of Israel in the wilderness, they forgot, how hard they had it in Egypt. And they started to long for the food of Egypt at different points. Let's go back to Egypt. What you bring us out in this wilderness for, Moses? To kill us, right? Let's go back. We had it so good.
Did they, though?
Yeah. I mean, at that point, they were subjects of pagans and they were slaves.
So, wait a minute, though. When it says you observe days and months and seasons and years, I've heard a lot of people talk about this, and they'll pair it with a verse in Colossians chapter 2, verse 16.
Yeah.
And they'll say that this is talking about the Torah, or this is talking about the biblical feasts and the Sabbath and things like that. How do we know that this is not what he's talking about?
Well, Paul is using entirely different words.
Okay.
In Colossians, he literally uses biblical words for new moon. He's using the words out of the Septuagint that describe the new moon and the Sabbath and the feast days. But here he's using entirely different words. He's not hearkening back to the Septuagint for these terms.
And remember,
these
the Septuagint,
are pagan festivals.
The Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Tanakh, or the Old Testament.
Yes.
So there were certain choices that they made to talk about the feasts in Greek and talk about the new moon or the Sabbath. All of it in Greek that had been accepted for 200 years. And in Colossians, he uses those specific Jewish context words. Yes. Of festivals, new moons, and Sabbath. But here, he uses days, months, seasons, and years, very generic, and he is using words that talk about the general practice of the pagan world, not the Jewish practice at all. So when he says this, he is not in any way talking about the biblical feast days or the biblical Sabbath,
the biblical calendar
at all. He is saying that they are being torn and pulled back into those practices of their former life.
Right.
Okay, and so he says in verse 12, I plead with you, brothers and sisters, become like me, for I became like you, and you have done me no wrong. So become like me. He is encouraging them to become like Paul, and he says, for I became like you. Well, doesn't that mean that Paul essentially, crossed over and became a Gentile?
Not at all.
Are you sure?
I'm positive.
Well, okay, well, what does he mean?
Well, he's talking about just the ability to fellowship with these people. So much of these things that Paul is talking about, again, harkens back to his problem with Peter earlier in chapter 2. It's the ability to sit down and fellowship, to have a conversation. It's the ability to just communicate with one another. Mm-hmm. He's put aside Jewish rules to sit down with these former pagans and share with them and love them and fellowship with them. And so in that sense, he's become like a Gentile.
Not that
but he has not left anything within the Torah.
Mm-hmm. So that when he says that, become like me because I became like you, doesn't he crossed a cultural barrier?
Yes.
And he was crossing that line that everybody else might not have been comfortable doing. It's it's what we need to do in our day when there are people that we're not comfortable being around, maybe a different racial group or different social economic class or whatever else like that. We still need to be willing, especially if they are believers, especially if they are our brothers and sisters in Christ, we don't need to exclude them and dismiss them and say, you're not welcome here.
Not at all.
So he is saying, I became like you, which means I crossed over these lines of uncomfortability to fellowship and join with you. But that is in no way saying that now he's going over there and participating with them in those past experiences of the days, months, seasons, and years. He's not participating in idolatry. He's not participating in eating food sacrificed to idols. He's not. He's still not going and eating, unclean foods by Jewish standards. But he is going, and he is willing to talk and sit down and fellowship with them.
Yes.
And he is encouraging them, because I took that step towards you. Now you need to continue taking these steps toward me. And that's the process of discipleship. Imitate me as I imitate Messiah.
Amen.
That's what he is calling them to.
Mm-hmm.
And so he pleads with them to continue on the process. You don't have to start over. You don't have to go back to the beginning of all of this and then go through a Jewish conversion process. You can continue in your faith in Messiah now. Don't believe the lie that says you have to start all over, or that what you did before in coming to faith doesn't count.
It wasn't good enough.
It wasn't good enough. That's what they were being told. So then in the next few verses, he's talking about his own ailments and sicknesses and things of which they helped him through. He talks about their commitment to him. But then verse 16, he says, have I become your enemy by telling you the truth? So some of the things that were being said about Paul is like, well, Paul, he doesn't know what he's talking about. He really needs to have a better education of these things. And besides, he just wants to keep you to himself. He's not really on your side during all of this. And that's what these Gentiles in Galatia were being told about him. But
can you imagine pouring your life into someone and then them turning on you?
Mm-hmm. That's hard to imagine. That is hard to imagine. Verse 17, Paul starts talking about those that are saying these things. He says, these others zealously court you, and not in a good way, but they wish to shut you out, to close the door of fellowship, to kick you out of the synagogue, essentially, because you have not gone through a conversion process. Right. You haven't done it the way they tell you to. They want to shut you out so that you will court them.
So they want to do to the Gentile believers what Paul was unwilling to do to them. Mm-hmm. Paul was willing to sit down with them, teach them, be there for them. And these others that are courting them, so to speak, are now pushing them away and saying, you're not good enough. You need to go and you need to start all over again, and pushing them away.
Mm-hmm. And these are people who believe. These Gentiles are people who believe, who are hungering after God, who are hungering for growth. And if they're doing something wrong, okay, well, tell me what I'm doing wrong and I'll change and I'll do it. Whatever you tell me to do, I'll do. Yeah. They have a hunger and a thirst for righteousness. And so if they all of a sudden get the door shut on them, they'll do anything they can to get the door back open.
Yeah.
And so those people who are telling it, these Judaizers who are telling them, are basically doing that to get them to court after them and do anything they said. In verse 18, to be courted is good, but let it always be in a good way, and not just when I am there with you.
Yeah.
My dear children, again, I suffer labor pains until Messiah is formed, is taking hold in you. I wish I could be with you now and change my tone, for I don't know what to make of you. So he is really burdened by the lie and the deception that's going on to try to convince them that they have to start all over.
He's asking the question, have I wasted my time with you?
Mm-hmm.
Have I poured in my life for nothing?
Mm-hmm. And so then he says, tell me, you who want to be under Torah, don't you understand the Torah? Don't you hear or listen to the Torah? If what they say is correct, I mean, we were talking about this earlier today.
We were.
What all were we saying about that?
Well, first of all, if they want to go back and be under the guardianship of Torah,
if they want to start with the covenant of Sinai instead of the covenant of Abraham,
right? I just lost my train of thought.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, if they want to go back to the covenant of Sinai, right?
For
back
their
to
salvation.
The Mosaic law for their salvation instead of back to the Abrahamic covenant, then
They need to understand
that is one way you can take that statement of going back under the law, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the other way? And the other way was?
I'm not sure where you're at, so.
Okay, well, you go back to where you were.
Okay.
So
you who want to be under Torah, don't you understand? Don't you hear and understand? Listen to the Torah. For it is written that Abraham had 2 sons, one by the slave woman, who's Hagar, and one by the free woman.
So he's saying, you want to be under the Torah, then listen to the Torah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
This is what the Torah says.
This is how the Torah sets it up and helps you understand things. Mm-hmm. But one, the son by the slave woman, was born naturally, while the other, the son bought by the free woman, was through the promise. Mm. And he's been talking throughout the whole book of Galatians about the significance of the promise. Mm-hmm. And how they are included, the Gentiles are included because of the promise given to Abraham.
Right.
All right, so verse 24 says, now these things are being treated allegorically. Okay, so he's giving what's called a midrash on these things. He is giving them, I'm making a comparison.
An illustration.
An illustration to help you understand this debate that we're having. So these things are being treated allegorically, for these are 2 covenants. And it's not what we typically understand it, how we treat it in traditional Christian theology. We treat this discussion as a debate between the Old Covenant or those things in the Old Testament versus things in the New Testament.
Right.
We make it about as if it's law versus grace, about God treated the old, worked this way in the Old Testament, and now that we're in Messiah, he's doing something else, something new. And that's not what's happening at all.
Not at all.
Because in this illustration, it is between 2 covenants that are both in the Torah.
Yes, it is.
The first, because he identifies them. All right, one of these is from Mount Sinai, giving birth to slavery. This is Hagar. That's the covenant.
Natural born son.
That's the Mosaic covenant, and it's not saying that the Mosaic covenant is bad, but it's saying that your salvation. Remember, the whole book is about salvation or justification. That if you start with the Mosaic covenant and try to earn your salvation through keeping the Torah, you're a slave. You will never be free. So the first one is Mount Sinai giving birth to slavery. This is Hagar. Mm-hmm. But this Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia and corresponds to the present Jerusalem, for she is in slavery along with her children. Why is he calling Jerusalem in slavery with her children?
Why is he? Well, he's doing that because the Jewish leadership did not accept Messiah. They did not recognize the time that the Father had set. Mm-hmm. They did not recognize his appearing. And so they rejected him. Remember, not all the Jews rejected him. Thousands upon thousands, 10,000s of myriads of Jews believed in him. But
as a whole. Right.
But some and the majority of the leadership rejected him, because not even all of the leadership rejected him. But they rejected him, and therefore they are still under slavery. Mm-hmm. They have not taken their positions as sons.
Right. That goes back to chapter 3, verse 24. It says, therefore the Torah became our guardian to lead us to Messiah, so that we might be made right based on faith, or based on trusting, based on the promise.
Right.
So the Torah of Mount Sinai is to lead, guide, and direct to Messiah. And if you have the Torah and you have all of that stuff, but you don't recognize Messiah, then you are still bound underneath that.
You're still thinking like a child.
You're still thinking like a child. So he's coming out. And the reason why that he says that Jerusalem is Hagar, it's not condemning the Old Testament.
No,
it's not
not
condemning even the Sinai covenant, but it's saying that they failed to recognize the purpose of it, which was to help them identify Yeshua as the Messiah.
Yes.
So this Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia and corresponds to the present Jerusalem, for she is in slavery along with her children. And until they recognize Messiah, they will stay that way.
Mm-hmm.
But the Jerusalem above is free, and she is our mother. For it is written, "Rejoice, O barren women who bears no children. Break forth and shout, you who suffer no labor pains. For more are the children of the desolate than of the one who has a husband." Then he says, "Now you, brothers and sisters," and who is he talking to here?
The Gentile believers.
He's talking to the Gentile believers. And so he says, "Like Isaac, you are children of promise." That's what he's been saying all along in this book. You, Gentiles, are as much a son of Abraham as Isaac is, because that was based on and given and coming through the promise. And that's a powerful statement.
That's a beautiful statement.
Mm-hmm. So, you, brothers and sisters, like Isaac, you are children of promise. You are saved by faith through the Abrahamic covenant, just like the Israelites were saved by faith under the Abrahamic covenant while they were in Egypt. They didn't receive Mount Sinai and the covenant there until after they got out of Egypt. So they were saved under the Abrahamic covenant.
Yeah.
But you, just as at the time the one born according to the flesh persecuted the one born according to the Spirit, the Ruach, so it is now. All right, so the ones who are still not recognizing Yeshua as Messiah are persecuting even those that all those who do believe in Yeshua as Messiah, both Jew, and their target primarily is the Gentile believers. There is a hostility that's going on here, just like Ishmael persecuted Isaac because he recognized, well, wait a minute. He is the heir, and I thought I was.
I thought I was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So he's mad about that. So so it is now that those that were still the ones of Hagar, remember, those that were still not recognizing Messiah are persecuting those that are born of the Spirit. But what does the scripture say? "Drive out the slave woman and her son, for the son of the slave woman shall not inherit with the son of the free woman. So then, brothers and sisters, we are not children of the slave woman, but of the free woman." And so when he's saying we in this passage, he's talking we who believe in Messiah, we who recognize Yeshua, we are the free woman. We are the daughters. We are Isaac. We are the sons and daughters of Sarah. And that's a powerful thing for him to say.
Yeah, we have all together received that adoption as sons. We have all become heirs together, whether Jew or Gentile. And this is not saying that Paul does not love his Jewish brothers and sisters who are not yet true believers in Messiah.
Not at all.
It's not saying that at all. And of course, he deals with more of this issue, especially in Romans chapters 10 and 11.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we get to Romans, we're going to go over stuff like that. You know, where he talks about they were cut off, the natural branches were cut off so that you could be grafted in, right? So he's going to go over that some more in Romans. But he just hits on that idea right here.
Yes. And some within church history have used that statement about driving out the slave woman and her son, because that's talking about unbelieving Jewish people. Mm-hmm. Some have used that as justification for all sorts of horrendous anti-Semitism.
And remember, Paul even tells you, I'm just giving an allegory, right? I'm just using an illustration. That's all he's doing.
Yeah. He's not giving the Christians permission to go and persecute and hunt down and drive out the Jews, which is, again, what some have used it for over church
No,
history.
yeah.
He is not wanting to reestablish a wall of hostility between the believers in Messiah and the unbelieving Jewish people. He would very much like for them to come
That's
to
his
recognize
hope. That's
Messiah.
his dream.
Yeah.
Just like it was for Moses to see all the people of Israel being filled with the Spirit and being led by the Spirit. This is Paul's dream, and he even tells us that. And I believe it's Romans. It is that he is doing partly. He's doing this ministry to the Gentiles in the hopes of winning some of his people. He loves his Jewish brothers and sisters.
And he still loves the Torah. He still loves the elements of the covenants that have been there, even the Mosaic covenant, because again, he's appealing to the Torah to make his case for the inclusion of the Gentiles.
Yes.
And so if it makes no sense that Paul would be appealing to the Torah if he was saying, oh, by the way, we have nothing to do with the Torah anymore.
Again, it's about proper order. The Abrahamic covenant first, then the Mosaic covenant. You don't go to the Mosaic covenant for salvation. It cannot save you. That is not its purpose. It never was. You have to go back to the Abrahamic covenant. They all did.
And so once you have been redeemed, then that covenant, that Mosaic covenant, then that's when you can start to grow and walk in that.
Yes.
But chapter 5 of Galatians says, for freedom, Messiah set us free. So stand firm and do not be burdened by a yoke of slavery again. Don't go back to the starting point. Don't go back. What these Judaizers were telling them to do is that their salvation by faith in Messiah doesn't count, and you have to start over with this conversion process. Don't be burdened by that again. Stand firm and don't give in to that.
You've become sons. You've become heirs. Why become that slave again?
So listen, I, Paul, tell you that if you let yourselves be circumcised, and
Yeah, go ahead.
That's in the whole, that's the legal discussion within Judaism about circumcision is the whole category of conversion to Judaism, to being legally a Jewish person. So if you let yourselves start over and be circumcised, Messiah will be of no benefit to you. All right, you have to start with Messiah first. And
we keep saying that circumcision is kind of the buzzword for that conversion process. That conversion process, again, involved for men, circumcision, for men and women, immersion.
Or baptism.
And also oaths to obey the Torah and sacrifice. So the sacrifice went with that. So that was all part of that conversion process. Oddly enough, since the fall of the temple, obviously they can't do the sacrifices anymore. They still want to have the men go through circumcision, but for the women, all that's left is the baptism. And I find that rather ironic. So anyway.
So, if you let yourselves be circumcised, Messiah will be of no benefit to you. Again, I testify to every man who lets himself be circumcised that he is obligated to keep the whole Torah. You who are trying to be justified, there's that word. This is what the whole book of Galatians is about, is justification or salvation. If you seek to be justified by Torah, have been cut off from Messiah, you have fallen away from grace. All right. So if you're going to go back and start over like they're telling you to, and go through this circumcision or process, this conversion process, then you have to keep all of it perfectly before you can come to Messiah.
Yeah, you're skipping over the Abrahamic covenant.
Yeah.
There's no faith involved at that point.
Yeah.
It's all on human effort, right? And yet there's got to be faith. There's got to be trust. You don't come to God through the legalistic side of things. Because if you do, you have to do it completely perfect for your salvation. And they had already messed that up.
Good luck with that, because we know
We
that
all have already
all
messed
have
that
sinned
up.
and fallen short
Right.
of the glory of God. And sin is the breaking of the Torah, as 1 John
Right.
3:4 talks about. So if you're going to if you buy into that argument and you have to go back and convert to Judaism, realize that unless you do it perfectly, then that's not going to count either.
If you're doing that for your salvation,
Yep. So
good luck with that.
For through the Ruach, through the Spirit, by faith, we eagerly wait for the hope of righteousness. All right. So by faith, by this, and he's already established, you have the Spirit. We eagerly wait for the hope of righteousness, for what we know has been given and transferred to us. We don't depend on our own righteousness. We trust in the fact that we have been given his righteousness. For in Messiah Yeshua, verse 6, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision has any meaning, but only trust and faithfulness expressing itself through love. Only faith expressing itself through love. And so he's saying, look, both Jew and Gentile has to be saved the same way. By faith in Messiah Yeshua. By faith in what the promise has been made. So whether you
all
are
must be born again.
Everybody,
whether Jew or Gentile.
And that was the confusion that Nicodemus had back in John chapter 3.
Just the fact that he was having that conversation with Nicodemus, not just a Jew, but a teacher of Israel, a teacher of the Jews. Even he had to be born again. So even he had to go back to the Abrahamic covenant.
Yeah. He was, and that confused the living daylights out of him. Is what do you mean I have to be born again? Because he's going down the list of all the things that qualify him for a right relationship with God, just like Paul does in some of his letters. Like, look, if anybody has confidence in the flesh, I have got more.
Right.
And I go this, and this. Nicodemus was like, well, I've got everything going for me. What else do I need? What else do I need to be in right relationship with God? And Yeshua says, well, what you're missing is you need to recognize the Messiah. And that's what Yeshua is talking to Nicodemus about being born again. Because born again is also a Jewish term.
Yes, it is.
For conversion. You've got to convert. And you go down into the waters of baptism. You're buried with Messiah in baptism. You're raised to walk in newness of life. That's talked about as being born again. And the Jews had that understanding already of your mikvah. Your conversion is you're losing your old identity and you've started a new one.
And they would even say you're being born again. When you come up out of that water, you're born again. You're an entirely different person.
Yeah, you're now a son of Abraham. And so Nicodemus is being told by Yeshua, it's like, you need to be born again. He's like, why? I already am. But he didn't recognize Messiah.
But that's not a conversion to Christianity.
No.
That's more of a conversion or being born again, being a new person, because you have recognized the Messiah. You've recognized the time that God has set for you to become who you were supposed to be, right? That you were supposed to become that heir, that son, no longer like young and like the slave, but with the full rights of the son and the heir. And the only way you can do that is by recognizing the one whom the Torah is pointing you to.
So, verse 7, you are running a great race. Who has blocked you from following the truth? You're already doing great. You're following the truth. Now, why are you listening to the people that telling you you've been doing it wrong all this time? This detour doesn't come from the one who calls you. And he says, a little chametz works its way through the whole batch of dough.
A little leaven.
A little leaven. A little of the yeast works its way through the whole batch of dough. And so if you've got, bad leaven or bad yeast, it's going to corrupt the whole batch of what is otherwise good.
And remember, even Yeshua with his disciples told them to beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. And he meant that in terms of what Paul is talking here. If they're going to tell you that you have to come to Messiah through them and not through Messiah himself, then that's leaven. That is false teaching.
And it's going to corrupt your walk with God.
Yes.
It's going to corrupt and destroy your faith. It's going to mess everything up for you. And the same thing is true of any kind of false teaching.
Mm-hmm.
Any kind of false teaching is the yeast that's going to destroy your walk of faith. And that includes things that we have grown up with in traditional theology, like replacement theology.
Oh, wow,
that says the church has replaced Israel and that God is done with them and cast them off, and now all the promises are ours. That is a yeast that has corrupted so many elements of our traditional theology. And it's scary how much it penetrates and messes things up.
Because we use that in arrogance, which is exactly what Paul tells us not to do, not to become arrogant. But that's exactly what we use it for.
So this yeast is dangerous. This is talking about false teaching. And so any kind of false teaching would fit that category. Verse 10, but he says, I am confident in the Lord that you will not think otherwise. But the one who is confusing you will pay the penalty, whoever he is. So those that are coming around trying to convince you that you as a Gentile, your conversion doesn't count, and you have to start over with this legal conversion process before you come to Messiah, he says, look, that guy, whoever's teaching you and confusing you, that is going to, they're going to be held accountable for their false teaching. As for me, brothers and sisters, if I still proclaim circumcision
or conversion
to Judaism, if he's speaking, against the Torah, if he's speaking against all these things, if I'm proclaiming circumcision, why am I still being persecuted? And that's referring back to his experience in the book of Acts. Mm-hmm. When he's traveling around, he comes back to Jerusalem, and all of a sudden everybody starts showing up saying all these things that Paul is saying and teaching.
Falsely.
We went through that a few nights ago.
Mm-hmm.
These accusations that he was speaking against the Torah. He was telling them to start ignoring the customs of Moses. He was accused of speaking against the temple and the Jewish people themselves. And all of those were false accusations. And his defense every time, but for every group after that, is him defending himself against those false allegations. But if he was telling them, look, if he was telling them, yeah, you need to convert to Judaism before you Gentiles can come to faith in Christ, he's like, man, I wouldn't have a problem. They would not be persecuting me at all if I was telling you that. So he is not on that page. He is not on that side at all. So if I've proclaimed circumcision, why am I still being persecuted? In that case, the stumbling block of the cross has been eliminated. Wow, that is a powerful statement. Because the starting point, again, is what? The starting point is
the Abrahamic covenant.
The Abrahamic covenant.
And the cross. It's the cross.
The promise of the seed that is to come that will lay down his life for you. That's where faith starts. That's where being added to the community, being, the promise being fulfilled starts, is the cross. But if these Judaizers are correct, and no, you actually have to go through the process of conversion first, then you're starting the conversation in totally different places. When we go and share the gospel, we don't start with, you need to convert to Judaism.
No.
Because then you may or may not ever get to the cross. Right?
Actually, you've already passed it by, because remember, that's part of the Abrahamic covenant.
Yeah. So he's basically saying that the stumbling block of the cross has been, you're not even talking about Yeshua as Messiah at that point. Right. You're talking about keeping the Torah in all of its perfect sense. So it's they're by making them start over, you're not even getting to the cross. And they may never get there because you might have lost them. That's kind of like...
I think it's important, what I just said. They're passing the cross by. The cross is part of the Abrahamic covenant. It's part of the promise. And so if you pass that over and jump over it to the Mosaic covenant for your salvation, well, who's going to turn around and look and go, oh, wait a minute. I needed the cross.
Mm-hmm.
You've totally left Messiah out again, and Paul makes that point in Galatians, right? That if you're gonna rely on for your salvation on the Mosaic law, then Messiah died for nothing.
Mm-hmm.
He suffered for nothing.
Yep.
So you can't skip over the cross to the Mosaic covenant and then go, okay, now I want Messiah. Well, you just already passed him up.
Mm-hmm.
So
in that case, the stumbling block of the cross has been eliminated. Chapter 5, verse 11. I only wish those who are agitating you would castrate themselves. You know, it's like, hey, if cutting off a little bit of flesh makes all that much of a difference, then man, just keep on going and get it over with. So he's speaking very bluntly and exaggerated, because he's saying that's how ridiculous this is. And again, this is a buildup of a long legal argument. Brothers and sisters, you were called to freedom.
Hold on a second.
Okay.
I want to say this about this next section of chapter 5.
Yes.
The rest of chapter 5 is literally a summary of Romans 6 through 11.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? So he's going to give you a quick summary of Romans 6 through 11, which we will deal with when we get to Romans.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, he's just going to hit it real quick here, because all this time he's been dealing with justification.
Mm-hmm.
And now he's going to move just briefly into some of the life of a believer.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so he's going to move into sanctification briefly.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So, brothers and sisters, you were called to freedom, and he's talking about the Gentiles. You are already free. Only do not let your freedom become an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another. For the whole Torah can be summed up in a single saying, love your neighbor as yourself. But if you bite and devour one another, watch out that you are not destroyed by one another. Okay? You have been made free in Messiah. But with that being made free, once you have moved from being a child to an adult, with that comes certain responsibilities. With that comes a greater way of life that you are called to, because you're not just a child anymore.
Right.
You're not just a slave anymore. There's a new way to live. So don't go off thinking that now that you have this freedom, that you can just do whatever you want, that you have, hey man, I've got no rules, I've got nothing that I'm responsible for anymore. It's like the kids who leave off for college or get out of mom and dad's house, and all of a sudden, man, it's like, okay, everything they ever taught me is now, I don't have to listen to anybody anymore. That's not what he's saying at all.
Mm-mm.
All right, don't let your freedom become an opportunity for the flesh, but through love, serve one another. And so this next verse especially, think, if Paul, in this whole time in Galatians, if Paul has been saying that, now that you believe in Messiah, you don't need the Torah anymore. Now that you believe in Messiah, you have no responsibility, you have no relationship to the Torah. The Torah adds nothing to your walk with Messiah. If he was really saying that this whole time, then make sense of verse 14 for me, which says, for the whole Torah can be summed up in a single saying, love your neighbor as yourself.
And oddly enough, he's hitting the second greatest commandment.
Mm-hmm.
So does he want you to bypass the first greatest commandment?
Not at all.
Not at all. So in hitting the second greatest commandment, he is taking in the first greatest commandment. The first is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and strength. And in the book of Mark, it actually starts with the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one.
Mark chapter 12, isn't it?
I can't remember the chapter.
I think it's 12.
But yeah, it actually starts with the Shema, which is the creed of Judaism. And so, we're to love the Lord our God with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength. And Yeshua goes on also to say that all, the law and the prophets hang on these two, which means that every law God ever gave all the things that the prophets ever taught are going to either be a part of loving God or loving your neighbor.
Mm-hmm.
That would include the Moed, the feasts, the Sabbath. It would include all of those,
Mm-hmm.
right? So all of those are means of loving God.
Mm-hmm.
You have the holiness code in Leviticus 19 that tells you how to love your neighbor.
Mm-hmm. So if he is eliminating the Torah from the life of the Christian, the life of the believer, it makes absolutely no sense for him to appeal to the Torah for them of how to treat one another.
Right.
And how to live. And that is Mark chapter 12, by the way. Mark chapter 12, verse 29, where he starts with the Shema. The whole Torah can be summed up in a single saying, love your neighbor as yourself. But if you bite and devour one another, watch out that you are not destroyed by one another. Because what's happening between these two groups,
yes,
what's happening between Jew and Gentile, and what the Judaizers are trying to do in slamming the door on these Gentiles coming to faith in Messiah, is they're causing bitterness and hostility and confusion and anger. And that is what their flesh is going to want to act out on. They're going to be getting mad at each other. They're going to create greater separation. And who wants that? Who wants there to be division between Jew and Gentile in Messiah?
And remember, the Israelites had this problem themselves between the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah.
Yes, they did.
Once they split, they started fighting each other.
Mm-hmm.
They would even call on other nations to come help them fight each other.
Mm-hmm.
That is never what God wants.
Mm-mm.
He does not want his children to be fighting with one another. But all of this that they're going through is going to lead to just that.
Mm-hmm. And they'll destroy one another, and the believing in Messiah community will be lost. So he says instead, but I say, walk by the Spirit, walk by the Ruach, and you will not carry out the desires of the flesh, which part of which is including lashing out at those who are teaching falsely.
Mm-hmm. And all that whole statement is Romans 6-8.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
For the flesh sets its desire against the Spirit, but the Spirit sets its desire against the flesh. For these are in opposition to one another. This is where the fight really is, between the Spirit of God and the old desires of the flesh, of what you were enslaved to before. That's where the fight really is.
Yeah, you can just hear, the echo of Romans chapter 7 here.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
So that you cannot do what you want. And remember, Galatians was written before Romans. But if you are led by the Ruach, you are not under the law, under the Torah. You are not, you're led by the Spirit, then you have what the Torah is leading you to, and that is Messiah.
You've become heirs. You've become sons.
Mm-hmm.
And you're expected to act like it.
Mm-hmm.
Right? You're not still looking for the Messiah. You're not being kept safe and protected until the Messiah comes anymore. He's come and you've recognized him and you have been declared a son and an heir.
And with that status change, then you have a new way of life that you're to live by as the Torah lays out. Because he says the deeds of the flesh, the deeds of what you were, are clear: sexual immorality, impurity, indecency, idolatry, witchcraft, hostility, strife, jealousy, rage, selfish ambition, dissension, factions, envy, drunkenness, carousing, and things like these. Those were all things that were relatively welcome within the pagan world. Mm-hmm. And so those types of things, they have to change and start conforming their lives to what the Torah calls them to. And he says, I am warning you, just as I warned you before, that those who do such things will not inherit God's kingdom. That's proof. If you're that's proof that you don't really have faith in Messiah, if that's still what your life.
And remember, even within the Torah, you're putting yourself back under the curse of the Torah is what you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
Because it even talks about, people who are completely rebellious and disobedient being cut off from their people. And that's what he's saying here. He's saying that people who do these things don't inherit the kingdom of God, i.e. they're cut off.
Mm-hmm. Every person has to choose this day whom you're going to serve. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. All those types of things. You constantly have to be living out your faith by your life. That's not a salvation issue at that point, but that is are you walking in what you say you believe?
Right.
Are you enduring to the end through all of these trials and temptations and things of that sort? Verse 22 says, the fruit of the Ruach, the fruit of the Spirit. And what does Ezekiel 36 say that the Spirit is supposed to help us do?
Cause us to obey his laws and rulings.
Yeah, that's what the Spirit, one of his roles from Ezekiel 36, that we will have our heart of stone removed, will be given a heart of flesh, will be filled with the Spirit. And so he will cause us to walk in his laws and keep his commands and all those types of things. And so this is the life of one who is doing that. And these are all things that should manifest in the life of the believer who is living by and reading and studying and keeping the Torah of God.
Yes.
And the fruit of the Spirit is love for God, love for your neighbor, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, goodness, faithfulness. Did I say gentleness twice? Gentleness and self-control.
Right.
Self-control is a fruit of the Spirit, of which you have to define. The Torah defines what right and wrong, what pleases God and what doesn't. And so self-control is one of those things who's causing us to walk in his Torah, in his laws, in his command.
And that goes against our flesh.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore it requires self-control.
Mm-hmm. Verse 24, now those who belong to Messiah have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires. And so if we live by the Ruach, let us also walk by the Ruach. And again, that's an allusion back to Ezekiel 36. Let us not become conceited, provoking one another and envying one another.
Arrogant.
Yeah.
Again, that whole section right there is a preview of Romans 6 through 11.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? So there's one thing we wanted to hit in chapter 6, and then we will be done with Galatians. And that is...
Well, he says, if someone is doing wrong, you who are directed by the Ruach, restore such a person in a spirit of gentleness, looking closely at yourself so that you are not tempted also. Verse 2 is really what we're looking at. Bear one another's burdens, and in this way you fulfill the Torah of Messiah.
Yeah. Now, what is the Torah of Messiah? And is the Torah of Messiah any different than the Torah of God given through Moses? Does Yeshua teach anything differently than what his Father gave? No. We know that he further explains the things his Father gave. He deepens them. He brings more of the heart of God to them. It's just not the letter of the law, right? But it is the spirit of the law. It is the things that reveal the heart of his Father for his people.
Mm-hmm.
But does Yeshua teach anything different other than the Torah that God gave through Moses?
Not at all.
Not at all.
Because he is constantly saying things. I speak only that which has been given to me or spoken to me by the Father.
That's right. I only say what my Father tells me to say.
Mm-hmm.
And so, he's teaching the things of his Father. Also, I think we have to realize a very important point, that if we say that the Torah of Messiah or the Torah of Christ is different from the Torah of God the Father, then we have just pitted the Son against the Father. May it never be.
Mm-hmm.
They are one. They are not against each other, right? And if the Torah says that, you are not to add or subtract, then the Son cannot do that. Because that would be going against the law of his Father.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So we have to be very, very careful on how we understand things sometimes and define things. We cannot go against what God has already spoken.
Mm-hmm.
And neither could Yeshua. Remember, he needed to be that spotless lamb, and to go against what his Father had already given would mean he was a sinner and therefore not a spotless lamb.
Mm-hmm. John, the Gospel of John has several statements like that. One of them I was going to highlight here is John chapter 14, verse 24, where he says, "He who does not love me does not keep my words, and the word you hear is not mine, but the Father's who sent me." Yeah. In other words, the Torah of Messiah, the law of Messiah, is not going to be any different than the law of his Father. There is not a law from Sinai that is in opposition to or contrasting to the law of Messiah. The Jewish people themselves already had built into their theology and understanding that when Messiah appears, he will explain everything to us. He will fully explain the mysteries and the hidden things and things that we couldn't understand, or the debated things, and all of those things that we were not sure about. The Messiah was going to come and fully explain and teach. And that's what he was saying back in Matthew chapter 5. I did not come to abolish or teach incorrectly the Torah, but I have come to fulfill, which is a Jewish idiom for saying I'm come to teach it correctly, to expand it to its fullness and its meaning.
And then he immediately began to do that
with the Sermon on the Mount. So the Torah of Messiah is not something different.
No.
And so Paul in this Galatians chapter 6 is calling on people to still be about fulfilling the Torah of Messiah.
But it's in light of Messiah as well. I think that's an important point we got to make.
Not to be saved.
Remember, the Torah, part of the purpose of the Torah was to lead people to Messiah.
Mm-hmm.
We're supposed to be able to go to the Torah and see Messiah all over it.
Yep.
So in obeying the Torah, we are doing it in light of Messiah. We are going to the Torah to find Messiah, to find the way Yeshua lived, to walk the way Yeshua walked, right? We want to see, we want to know Messiah.
Absolutely.
And the Torah reveals Messiah. Yeshua again said, Moses wrote about me. And so the Torah of Messiah, is not a different Torah from his Father. And it highlights who he as the Messiah actually is, as well as the heart of his Father.
Mm-hmm. For how once his people are saved, yes. Once his people are redeemed, once they have been made sons through the promise given to Abraham and the Abrahamic covenant, this is how his people live in light of their salvation, not to gain their salvation, but because they are saved.
Again, proper order. Mm-hmm. Abrahamic covenant first, then the Mosaic covenant. The Mosaic covenant makes no sense without the Abrahamic covenant.
Mm-hmm.
To obey Torah, to truly, from the heart, obey Torah and do it in the power of the Spirit cannot happen without the cross of the Abrahamic covenant.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Otherwise, it's just the letter of the law, and it's just doing your checks.
Human
effort. I did this.
Not good enough.
And he calls us to live in the power of the Spirit. Right? And we'll get more fully into that when we go through Romans.
So, and we've been talking a good while.
We sure have.
So we're going to call it a night. May the Lord bless y'all. Be sure and leave your comments and your questions and things, and we'll try to get to them. But remember, always, go check out our website, www.restorationmessiah.com. And if you're in the East Tennessee area, we'd love to have you come and join us some Shabbat, because I assume that we're going to be gathering together in person before too long. Yeah. The sooner the better. The Lord willing, that we'll be able to do that. So may the Lord bless y'all. Have a good night. And we'll see you here tomorrow, 6 o'clock.
Shalom.
Shalom.